thankful today to have the historian, biographer, and writer Henry Wiencek here to speak with us today and offer a Q&A after his speech. Henry's numerous and award-winning books include Master of the Mountain, Thomas Jefferson and His Slaves, An Imperfect God, George Washington, His Slaves, and the Creation of America, and a book with local ties, The Hairstons, An American Family in Black and White. And that book won the National Book Critics Circle Award in Biography in 1999. In his work, Henry seeks to understand the history that illuminates our shared past, black and white, free and slave. In bravely uncovering the flaws of our past, Henry also shows us the strength of our shared history. In each of his books exploring the fundamental American struggle to secure freedom and equality for all, he shows us how united we are in this region, in the South, and in our nation. As we look to the past today to understand where we came from, who we are, and what life we can make together for our future, I can think of no better speaker to talk to us on the importance of tracing the past to find our common and present future. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Henry Wiencek.
Thank you. I'm really impressed that there's such a big crowd today on such a beautiful day. I hadn't expected it. Not that I don't think that I'm a star attraction, but I'm just really impressed that so many people have come out to talk about exploring your past and to talk about that past itself, which has so many hidden byways and hidden trapdoors and hidden glories and hidden things that some of us are not really happy to discover. I live in Charlottesville, which is kind of an accident, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but and I came down here on 29, which for me was the road of discovery, the road of disappointment, the road of going home to my wife after visiting North Carolina or Virginia or Southern Virginia or Mississippi and saying, I didn't find anything. And her saying, well, how much longer is the book going to take? The 29 and 86 are associated with that really was my path into the past. First of all, it was the road that took me into North Carolina to go to Coolamy Plantation, which is south of Winston-Salem on the Yadkin River near Lexington. It was the road that took me to 86, which took me to Chapel Hill, which is where the Hairston family plantation papers are. It was the road, 29 was the road that took me partially down, or I would come down partially on 29 and then turn west and go into Stokes County, where there is a huge group of Hairstons and has been for 200 years. Coming down 29, when I passed Tight Squeeze, I would then turn right and go to Martinsville, where there is another cluster of Hairstons and Hairstons who've been there for over 200 years. So that road had lots of memories for me. And it originally, when I started this project, took me back and forth partially to New York, which is where I was living at the time, and because I want to tell you a little bit about how I got started on writing about Southern history, and particularly about the Hairston and Hairston families. I'm a living example of how a completely ignorant person can begin to unravel some of the naughtiest parts of our past just through perseverance. And that's one of the messages I want to pass on to you. If you think that the individual family work that you're doing or whatever historical work that you're doing is important, don't give up. And I tell this to my writing students. The most important thing for a writing student is not talent, it's perseverance. You just keep going, you keep looking. Eventually you will find something. It may not be what you expect. Always keep your eyes open to the sides. Always be alert to the accidental discovery. Always go 1 mile farther, just keep looking. Spend more time in the library. Go to bigger and bigger libraries. Go to bigger and bigger courthouses. Keep looking for those names that mean so much to you. When I was doing my book, the internet barely existed. So things are easier now, but the internet's got so much that you've got to put filters on to learn how to find exactly what's important to you. But just as a little bit of brief background, I came down to the South as a Yankee to write about the great Southern plantation houses, what, glorious pieces of architecture they were. And my initial assignment was to more or less ignore the past and just celebrate the structures, celebrate the genteel society, the elite society that built these houses. But as I got more and more deeply into my work, I became more and more interested in the people who lived in those houses, and I got more and more interested in the African American families who had toiled at those places for generations, sometimes hundreds of years, and seemed to have disappeared, seemed to have gone with no trace, not even a graveyard, nothing. It was as if black people never died, because you can't find where they were buried. And as I interviewed the descendants of the white slaveholders who still owned many of these houses, I asked them, well, whatever happened to the descendants of the slaves who lived here? And nobody ever knew until I got to Coolamy Plantation in North Carolina. And the man who lived there was Judge Peter Hairston, whose grandfather had built the house just before the Civil War. And that was something that struck me about the South, is how slowly time moves here. I met a brother and sister in the eastern part of North Carolina whose uncles had died in the Civil War. And when I thought they'd left out a generation, they meant great uncles, but no, it was their uncles who had died. And so that's how close the past was. Judge Peter's grandfather was born in 1819, and very few generations had passed there. Anyway, I asked him that question, and he said, oh, there are Hairstons who live all around here. Do you want to meet them? And he just picked up the phone, and he called a man named Squire Hairston, who had the same last name as the judge, although he pronounced it differently. Any of you who have read my book know that this is how the book begins. And Squire came over right away, because Judge Peter had told him, there's a man from New York who's interested in your family history. So Squire came over, and Squire and Peter greeted each other very warmly in the library of the old slave master's house. And I thought this was a stunning scene, because Peter's grandfather had owned Squire's grandfather. And I thought that I was witnessing a sign of a reconciliation that had taken place over a very ugly past. And when I asked Squire, after Judge Peter left the room, how he felt about Peter, he said, I don't know a better man than Peter. He said, I consider him one of my closest friends. But then, when I tried to get Squire to talk about some of the memories that might have been passed down in his history about slavery time and afterwards, he wouldn't say anything. He actually laughed. And I was taken aback by that, but then I realized that it's not possible for him to convey in a short interview everything that he could, that had been passed down to him. And I thought a lot of the things that had been passed down, he probably doesn't feel like talking about. So the interview concluded very, very poorly. He just stood up and went to the door to leave. But then something came over him, and he turned around and said, if you're really interested in my family history, why don't you come to our reunion? We're getting together in September in Baltimore. And this was June. And I said, okay, fine, yeah, I might do that. I didn't expect to, but when the time came around, I did. Not expecting to get very much. I thought there'd be about 40 or 50 people there, maybe not even that many. But they had 1,000 people at the BWI Marriott. They had taken over the whole building. And I went from one person to another, trying to get as much information as I could in the very brief time I had. I was only going to be there for the afternoon. And I saw the whole spectrum of American life. I mean, I met doctors and lawyers, I met bus drivers, I met barbers, I met mechanics, I met retired miners, I met people who had come from distant parts of the West, I met people from the North, people from all over the South, and of course a huge number of people from this part of the world, this part of North Carolina and Virginia. And many of them spoke very highly about the judge and about the white family. So this embedded in my mind that I had stumbled across a fantastic story of the reconciliation of this large family, and that it seemed to signal that maybe the past wasn't as bad as we had been led to believe. But as soon as I got into my research, that whole idea crumbled. The documents told a much different story. The past was very violent, it was ruthless, And I'll tell some of these stories here. And I also came across extraordinary stories of heroism in the African American family that nothing in my historical studies had led me to expect. I had spent 3 years as the editor of the Smithsonian Guide to Historic America, which was a catalog to all the historic, a 12-volume encyclopedia of all the historic sites in the United States. And I told my writers, wherever you go, please try to make a special effort to find African American sites. And they came back with very little. This was in the 80s, and I began to think, well, if my scouts and writers, who are all really good, can't find much, maybe there isn't much there to be found. Maybe there really isn't much of an African American history. And this was my thinking in the 80s. But it was only when I began to dig into these records, impelled by this connection that I had begun to feel with both the white and the black families, that an extraordinary African American story began to come out of the records. It's just that nobody had looked for it before, or very few people, mainly researchers in the Hairston family itself. But I'm sorry to say that, for most white Americans, that's the attitude that they held, and many of them still do, because we don't have enough monuments to African American heroes and heroines of the past. And one of the things that became apparent to me is that when you study local history and regional history very carefully, that's where the African American role is really leaps out at you. And you see how important black Americans have been since the earliest days of this country, when we were still colonies of England. That they were important as farmers, and in some early cases even as landowners, as builders of our most important institutions, churches, schools, businesses. It goes all the way back to the beginning. And a lot of those accomplishments were erased or were forgotten or deliberately suppressed. I want to talk a little bit about how I came across some of these stories. One of the most amazing things that I came across was a story. It really has the outlines of an epic, but I found it in a single letter written just after the Civil War by a white slave or former slave owner Peter Hairston, the father of, or the grandfather rather, of the builder of Coolumee. He was writing to his wife about something an overseer had told him, about something that some former slaves had told him. Now, after the Civil War, as many of you know, there was a great movement of African Americans trying to find, some of whom left their homelands, trying to find better work or trying to find missing family members. And the overseer told Peter, the owner, in a letter, that some people who left have come back. And he's writing about the western part of Pennsylvania. It's Axton, which I think is still in Pennsylvania. I don't know, or is it in Henry? It might be in Henry. But there was a place called, a little plantation there called Camp Branch. He said, some people who left have come back. They said that they crossed one big river and got to another they could not see across. And they saw the sun set in it. And people told them that if they could get across that river, they would be in Cuba, and the people there would sell them. They turned away and got to another big river, the Mississippi. They got a boat and trying to cross the Mississippi. Some of them drowned, and they decided to come back. Now, looking at trying to figure out what this trip consisted of is kind of tricky on these newfangled computer maps we have, especially if they're just the size of your hand. When I was doing this, I pulled out one of those huge Automobile Association maps of the South and pinned it up on the wall. All right, you go from southern Virginia to the big river where Cuba is on the other side. That's the Gulf of Mexico. They had walked from Virginia to the Gulf of Mexico, and then they turned west and went to the Mississippi River. And that's where the catastrophe occurred, and some of them were drowned in the river, and then they came back. Why Mississippi? It's because in the 1830s, 30 years earlier, some of their family members had been torn away from Virginia and moved to Mississippi. When 3 of the white Hairston brothers decided to buy land down there and open cotton plantations when the federal government had chased the Indians out and opened it to white settlement. There had always been communication back and forth between the families in Mississippi and Virginia. So this very brave group of people went on this extraordinary journey, and when you measure it on one of those big maps, it's over 2,000 miles. If they had walked directly west from Virginia, they would have ended up in Colorado if they'd walked 2,000 miles. This told me a number of things. It told me, first of all, about the bravery and the courage of these people who clearly had never left that part of Virginia and had only a vague idea of geography. But they still had the courage to set out. Why? They were looking to find their relatives. They wanted to rejoin their families. That spoke to me about the incredible power of family connections. And this goes back to, my interest in that goes back to a notion that a lot of white researchers had in as late as the 1970s and 1980s, which is that slavery had destroyed any family connections that black people had. And that even if they were able to form families, that they had been smashed by slavery. Well, this and other evidence completely disprove that. Of course, African Americans have always known that to be false, but white people had no clue as to what really happened, and had no clue as to the strength of the black families, even under slavery. I made another discovery when I was along these same lines. When I was looking for, in the 90s, for what was then a very rare document called the Cohabitation Register. Now, as you probably know, any of you who have done research know into family history, that that slave marriages didn't exist under the law until slavery was over. They had no substance because masters could break apart families whenever they wanted to. But the law just didn't recognize them. And people could be together as husband and wife as long as they liked and had children together, but there was no legal recognition of it. However, when the Civil War ended, the federal government recognized the fact that some marriages had existed among slaves earlier, but there was no mechanism to record these marriages. So they ordered the federal organization known as the Freedmen's Bureau, whose job was to look after the rights and the welfare of the freed people in the immediate years after the war. They ordered their agents in every locality to draw up something called a cohabitation register. They would call the people in and have them register their marriages, the name of the husband, name of the wife, the names of all of their children and the ages, which plantation they had come from, and what jobs they had. Now, a lot of those documents, it seemed in the 1980s and 90s, had simply disappeared. For all of the counties in Virginia, there were only 4 that had apparently survived, and they were in the National Archives. I had a hope, and I had a hunch, that if I looked hard enough, I might find the cohabitation register for Henry County or Pittsylvania County. First of all, I went to the courthouses. They didn't know. They'd never heard of it. I went to Chatham and I went to Martinsville. They didn't know. I went to the Library of Virginia, then called the State Archives. And I made them go through all of their records, and they said, no, there's nothing like that here. We have no idea what you're talking about. So then I went back to Martinsville, and I have a somewhat unfortunate story to tell you, but some of the older folks in this room will recognize the attitude. I went into the regional library in Martinsville, and I asked the librarian at the main desk if he'd ever heard of this thing called the Cohabitation Register, because I was doing research into the African American Hairstons. And he said, the black families, you won't find anything about them here. And he was very dismissive. And so he pointed me to a file cabinet and said, well, you can start going through those files. We have some old newspaper clippings in there. Well, another librarian, also a white person, came over and apologized for the brush off that the man had given me and said, if you're really interested in the Hairston history, you need to go to the little library out in the country called at Bassett. If you know it now, it's now the Bassett Historical Center, but it didn't used to be that big, beautiful facility. It was a little set of rooms, much smaller than this room, right on the river in Bassett. So I went there and I met this fantastic woman named Pat Ross. And then when she found out that I was researching the Hairston, she brought me into a little research room and began pulling out boxes of papers and such. And I said to her, "Oh, it's a terrible shame that the cohabitation register has been lost." And she said, "Lost? No, it isn't. I have it right here." And she reached up onto a shelf and pulled it down and opened it for me. And it was not the original, it was the transcription. And I can talk about that in a minute. But as I opened it, my hands began to shake. One page after page after page. Hairston, 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 Hairston. There were 700 Hairstons in there. And it gave I could piece together, when I copied that whole thing and brought it home, I was able to piece together the stories of generations of people who had lived in that part of Virginia. And I found that these people, contrary to what had been written about them, had held marriages for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. There were two couples who'd been married for 50 years. And I could, by tracing the names of the children and then the grandchildren, I could piece together the generations of genealogies. In brief, what happened was the original cohabitation register had been sitting for about 80 years in the old Martinsville jail. It was just sitting in a corner. And when they were cleaning out the jail, they found it and opened it up and thought it might have some importance. So they called a local African-American researcher, and he recognized it immediately that it was important. So he put together a team of people who transcribed it. He put the transcription into the library, gave the document back to the county, and then it disappeared. But it was only after my book came out that they made another search for it, and they had moved to a new facility, and somebody was able to find it there. So now it's been scanned, and it's in the Library of Virginia. It's been scanned, it's digital, it's online, it's searchable. And since the 80s, I don't know what the current number is, but there are 11, 12, or 13, Shelley would know, cohabitation registers that have now turned up in the state of Virginia. These are amazing resources, and they're amazing documents about the strength of the black families during slavery. I want to tell another story about going to every possible source and tugging at every possible string, because you never know what you're going to find. I mentioned that in the 1830s, three of the Hairston brothers, this family was enormously wealthy. The story goes that in the old days you could walk from Danville to west of Martinsville and never leave Hairston land. And then when you got to a certain point, you could go south, and then there'd be a little bit of a gap, but then you were in Stokes County, and they owned most of Stokes as well. There was a man down there called Sorrowtown Peter, who had children with his slave. But now, where was I? Oh yes, I told you that in the 1830s, there were three brothers who went down to Mississippi because the family had done so well planting tobacco here. And they had so many slaves. They had a surplus of cash. They had a surplus of enslaved people. And don't let anybody tell you that slavery was an unprofitable business. It was a bonanza. Even people like Jefferson, who went around crying poverty his whole life, was making a fortune from slavery. But we can go into that later on. So I went down to Mississippi for a couple of reasons. But one of them was to see if I could find, what traces of the African-American Hairstons I could find in any records possible. The place where the Hairstons and Hairstons settled was in Lowndes County, Mississippi, south of a town called Columbus. If anybody knows where the University of Alabama is in Tuscaloosa, if you go west about 70 miles, you'll run into Columbus, and that's where the Hairston and Hairston Empire was. So I researched all the records there, and then I went to the state capitol in Jackson to see what I could find. It's for those of you who are serious researchers, it's an interesting phenomenon that state the quality of 19th century records varies tremendously from state to state and even from county to county. Here in Virginia, or no, actually we're not in Virginia, across the line in that big state to the north, there are voluminous records left behind by the Freedmen's Bureau about jury trials, about criminal justice, about rations fed to both whites and blacks after the war, about schools being built and destroyed, and about every aspect, almost every aspect of African American life in the immediate aftermath of the war. Here in North Carolina, the records are fewer. If you go to Mississippi, there are very, very few. There's almost nothing left, and I'm not even sure that they were able to get many Freedmen's Bureau officers into Mississippi. And also you'll find that there are great variations from county by county by county. So just because you can find a lot in Virginia, if you go to another state to research another part of your family, it doesn't mean you're going to find the same class of records. But anyway, I went to Mississippi, went to the state capitol at Jackson, and I was disappointed to see that there weren't all that many records. But one thing they did have, an archivist pulled out for me, she said, "We have this old marriage register." I said, "Oh, this is exactly what I want." And it was not a cohabitation register, but it was a big ledger book that was kept by the military headquarters in Vicksburg, which recorded all the marriages of ex-slaves who had fled to Vicksburg, because Vicksburg, after Ulysses S. Grant conquered Vicksburg on the 4th of July, 1863, and that place immediately became a magnet for people who wanted to free themselves from slavery. And so the commander there began recording marriages. And I went through that list very carefully until I came across the name of, it's the answer to the prayers, Hairston, Harston, Thomas Hairston, born in Virginia. Even though he was black, he used the white pronunciation, and that's how it had been written down by the clerk. But next to his name was an abbreviation that I didn't understand, and this is where the thread begins to open up. It was written USCC. And so I asked the clerk what that meant, and he said, "Oh, United States Colored Cavalry. Thomas was a soldier. He was a cavalryman." Now, I didn't even know there was a colored cavalry. I knew nothing about it. So I began digging into that history, and I found that the 3rd United States Colored Cavalry was one of the hardest fighting, most heroic units in the South. And in many ways, in some ways, they played a very, very important role in bringing the war to an end. But I'll just tell you one or two stories that came out of that. Thomas was a bugler. I was able to get his service record in the National Archives. Once I had his unit designation, I was able to go up there and get some of the unit records and go digging through other items. And then there was a history of the unit written by one of the white officers. And in that, he talked about how when the white officers were first assigned to this unit, they were very doubtful about the quality of the black troops. I mean, these guys had just come off the farm. Many of them were uneducated. And these white officers were educated men from the North, and they had been brought up to believe that black men, would be cowardly in battle, that they couldn't learn any basics in training. So they were very worried. But who was personally behind this was General Ulysses S. Grant. He had assigned one of his top officers, Colonel Osmond, who had been in charge of Grant's personal bodyguard. He pulled him from that assignment and said, "I want you to lead this cavalry unit." That's how important it was to General Grant. And so Osmond put them through a very rigorous training program. And as a training exercise, they crossed the Mississippi River from Mississippi into Louisiana. They encamped for the night. And suddenly they were ambushed by a larger group of rebels. The Confederates had been tracking their movements and knew where they were, and in the middle of the night, they jumped them. Well, the men knew exactly what to do. They responded to their training. They formed a line at a fence. They, and even though it was dark, they didn't yield any ground, and the fighting became hand to hand. But they drove off the rebels. And in the morning, their officer wrote a report saying this troop will fight till the last man. And then they went off on an expedition into central Mississippi to Yazoo City, where once again they were surrounded by a much superior Confederate force, a full brigade of Confederates who had not only troops, but they had artillery. And they were from Texas, and they were commanded by a man whose name was Sul Ross, who was known as a murderer of black prisoners. He was a take-no-quarter guy. And the first sign that the that the 3rd USCC had that they were up against this Texas brigade was when they came across some of their own men in the road, not only dead, but mutilated. And so they knew who they were up against. And they took refuge in a hastily made fort. They were surrounded by Sul Ross. They were bombarded for a couple of days. And then Sul Ross sent in a message. He said, we will let the white officers go if they will surrender. As for the black troops, I make no promises. And the white officer sent a note back basically saying, go to hell. We're in this together. And one of his subordinates said, he don't scare a damn. And so the signal was given. The Texas Brigade attacked. At that moment, another black unit came steaming up the Yazoo River, the 4th Louisiana, firing their guns on the Texans, who turned and ran. Someone later made an interesting discovery among the letters of the Texas Brigade. The men from Texas, even though they were diehard Confederates, the enlisted men, were absolutely disgusted at their commander's policy of allowing or ordering the murder of black troops. And one of them had written to his family back in Texas, you hear it said all over the camp, damned if I won't leave if this prisoner killing isn't stopped. So they didn't have any heart for going into this fight to go in and kill black men whom they regarded as soldiers. So when they had an excuse, they turned and ran. Of course, the black troops had a lot to do with that too. But Thomas fought throughout that campaign, and later they fought to cut off all the supplies that were going north from the Deep South to supply General Lee and the armies that were trying to relieve him at Petersburg, in Richmond. So they played an important part in bringing the war to an end. The other sad part of this is that the 3rd Colored was mustered out of service in Memphis, Tennessee, and a riot broke out because a lot of Irish troops and Irish men who lived in Memphis did not like the idea of having to compete for jobs and with blacks, and also didn't like the idea of black men voting. So there was a riot there, and a number of people were killed. But a lot of the black men at that point apparently decided to move west and settle out there. But all of that story came out of just finding that one name in a marriage register in Vicksburg with the initials next to it, USCC. I just want to read briefly one story that was something that really pulled me through the book, and I think that when you hear it, some of you may know it, you'll see why it would pull me. And this is one of the things, I said I had a couple of reasons for going to Mississippi. This is one of them. How many of you are familiar with the Berry Hill plantation and the Oak Hill plantation? Okay, you know that part of the world. The Hairstons were like an old medieval family. They married each other's cousins to keep all the money, the land, and the slaves within the family. Part of that was they were isolated. They didn't have too many other people of their social station to marry. And part of it was that they really did want to keep the property in the family. Now, there was a very, very wealthy slaveholder named Robert Hairston who married his first cousin, Ruth. Ruth had been married once before to a Wilson, And as you know, the Wilsons were also one of the wealthiest families in that part of the world. And I think they were among the founders of Danville. So Ruth had married a Wilson, had one child, and then Mr. Wilson died, leaving her as one of the wealthiest widows in this part of the world. So whom does she marry but her cousin, Robert? And so this was kind of a union of bank books and a union of slave ledgers. They probably controlled, well, it's said that Ruth owned about 1,500 or 2,000 slaves, so that she was the biggest slave-holding woman in Virginia. And Robert himself had another 1,000 or 1,500. Robert, however, began to have very serious misgivings about slavery. And he began to have arguments with his wife about this. And then he did something in secret that no other Hairston had ever done. He set some slaves free. This was in the 1830s. He opened a secret correspondence with one of the agents of the Colonization Society, which was set up to allow to establish a colony in Africa where freed slaves could go. And a lot of people, it's kind of, in a way it was like going into exile, but for some people it was the only way out of slavery. Robert was corresponding with this person, and the agent wrote back to him and said, on thus and such a date, we have the ship Jupiter leaving Norfolk for Africa. So Robert jumped into action immediately. He was going to free 6 people. He gathered cash, he gathered supplies, he gathered wagons, and he sent them on their way. And they made it safely to Norfolk and then to Africa. And there's a footnote to this, which I'll tell you later if you'll remind me to tell you. But he and Ruth had a huge fight. Robert abruptly left the house, jumped on his horse, and disappeared. And this is one of the richest men in Virginia. He suddenly goes missing. And then he turned up in New York. He wrote a letter back to his family saying, I'm in New York. Then he went to Saratoga, the big horse racing place, where the wealthiest of New Yorkers went. Then he went back to New York, and then he got on a ship and went to France. And before he left, he wrote a letter to one of his brothers saying, I cannot find peace anywhere. He spent some time in France, then got on another ship and decided to come home to the United States, but not to Virginia. He went to Mississippi, where he had been one of the 3 brothers who bought immense stretches of land and had started cotton plantations. So he went down there and was working, sort of side by side with the slaves. It was thought that he treated his enslaved people better than most folks down there. He let them walk around free without travel papers, which got him in trouble. He established a hospital for his slaves on the plantation. And he also anyway, I will get into the story right now. I'll just read a short section from the book. So, and we're talking now about the 1850s. So Robert was then in his early 60s. Robert did not expect death to come when it did. In March 1852, he went to his plantation on the Tombigbee River, several miles from his home place, to supervise his cotton warehouse. The overseer, who owed Robert money, had abruptly run off. It was an unhealthy location. Robert had been warned that it was very unhealthy. Robert's chief manager, who had earlier served him loyally by protecting the black Hairstons against hostile farmers in the region, flatly refused to go there, saying that he thought that place called the Bluff was a death sentence. So Robert went himself, and after working several weeks by the river, he came down with pneumonia. At first, he didn't think that he was dying, but his health went down precipitously. His brother Hardin hurried to the Bluff with his sons and a son-in-law to look after Robert. It soon became apparent to the Hairstons that they were at a death watch. Robert became feebler, losing consciousness from time to time. He called for Hardin's son, Major George, and said that he wished to write his last will. George, who had studied the law but had never practiced it, sat next to him and took down what his uncle said. Robert told George he would give him some property and 4 slaves. As for the rest, all the slaves and all the plantations, Harston's Bend, Moore's Bluff, Hishahoma, Cox's Place, Coleman's, Nashville Place, Leatherwood, that's the name you'll recognize, and all the other land in North Carolina and Virginia, all would go to his child. His child? He didn't have any children. Yes, he did. He told them that he'd had a child with a slave, a 6-year-old girl. All of his property would go to that child, and she was to be set free. And that property, by the way, was worth, when you add in all the slaves, was worth about $1 million in 1852. George wrote the will immediately and read it aloud to Robert, who expressed his approval and signed it. George left his uncle's side to show the document to his father, Hardin Hairston, and the other relatives who had gathered to witness Robert's passing and get their hands out. Stunned by this amazing document, which dashed their hopes of instant wealth, they burst into Robert's room and raged at him as he lay on his deathbed. They told him that the bequest to his daughter would not stand, that it was illegal in Mississippi for a slave to inherit property, and that Robert could not legally set his daughter free in a will. Robert responded, "Major George says it can be done." But Robert suddenly became frightened that his only child would remain a slave. Major George suggested that the bequest might go through if the girl could be carried off to a free state. This prospect tantalized Robert, but he realized that the will would have to be written by a skilled lawyer if it would stand in court. He sent a messenger to the town of Aberdeen, 20 miles away, to fetch a lawyer. It was already night, and the man couldn't leave until the next day. Hardly had the man left when it became apparent to Robert that he wouldn't live out the day. He sent for another lawyer who lived close by, a man named Gilmer. He arrived about 7 in the morning and went directly to Robert's bedside. Robert dictated a new will. There was no time left to him for any details. He was drifting into a stupor. He declared simply that it was his final wish that the girl be made free and that she possess his entire estate. And then he directed Gilmer to write something he had left out the previous day. "I will my body to its mother dust and my soul to my Father, Almighty God." As Gilmer hastily wrote these words, Robert lost consciousness. He hadn't signed the paper. Gilmer shook him awake and showed him the will. With tremendous effort, Robert strained and squinted, but he couldn't read it. He asked for glasses. When he had them on, he looked over the parchment and pronounced himself satisfied. Gilmer placed a pen in Robert's hand and guided him to sign the will. Robert sank back on his bed and drifted away for the last time. He had turned the world upside down. A slave girl was now one of the richest women in the United States. And so that's what brought me to Mississippi. I wanted to find out what happened to that girl. Because she doesn't turn up in any records of being a 6-year-old millionaire. And if you want to find out, you can read the book. But because it took me a long time to find out. The court records were, there was a note in a clerk's office that made a bare mention of it, but it was actually, it turned out to be incorrect. The records spelled the girl's name 3 different ways. There was Krillis, Chimble, Chimchil. It was a very odd, it had to be a very odd name, but the most persistent spelling I saw was Krillis. But I went down there. There was a family reunion of the white Hairstons. That was kind of the occasion for my going down. But after that, I literally went door to door in the old plantation country to every black home that had any association with the Hairstons, or the Hairstons, either by blood or having worked with them, and asked about this girl. And darned if some of them didn't know. I mean, the stories had persisted for 150 years, or almost 200, over 130 years. So it's really amazing what you can turn up when you actually look. And then I later found court records related to the case, which were extremely illuminating and talked in great detail about some of the things that happened later. But I want to conclude by talking about that footnote I mentioned about the Hairston slaves going to Africa. Through the miracle of the internet, you can look up the voyages of a lot of the colonization ships between the U.S. and Africa, and they have passenger lists, and you can see what happened to some of the people over there in Africa. there were 6 people sent from the by Robert, and it seems, unfortunately, that either 3 or 4 died very quickly of disease, but at least 2 of them survived. And after the book came out, I was going to an event at the University of Virginia, and one of the professors came over to me and said, "Oh, Henry, there's a woman here visiting from Liberia, and her name is Hairston." And I said, "Oh my God, where is she?" And he's looking, "Oh, I think she left, but I'll fix you up with her." Well, within days, she had left the country and gone back to Africa. But obviously, the family had not only had survived, but in some ways had prospered in Africa, because here comes someone who's a professor of something in an African university, attending an international conference at the University of Virginia. I mean, talk about a homecoming. So anyway, I will leave it off there, and I will be happy to answer any questions that I can, or hear any comments. The microphone is there, and if nobody has a question, I'm going to begin to point to people and make them come up. So, thank you. Thank you. No one in this whole conference has a question? Okay, there you go. There's no charge.
Hi, my name's Gordon. Ms. Dixon said something about your work with George Washington, the
Yes.
first president. And I love this area, this region, the Dan River region. And I've always heard that when Washington was surveying maybe the North Carolina-Virginia line or something, he realized that this was like Eden, that the Dan River was this and that. And I wondered if
you're getting
light on that.
no, you're getting him mixed up with William Byrd, who surveyed this area with a party in the 1730s, 1720s. I'm sorry?
Maybe 1750.
Thank you. 1728 says here, and now I hear
1750, I think.
1750. But he wrote a book, a couple of books, and he
quoting Washington.
Yeah, well, it was Byrd who named this the land of Eden, who called it Eden. But George Washington was a surveyor, but I don't think he got any farther south than Fauquier County, up in Virginia.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, you have a question.
I have a couple of questions.
Okay.
Did you have to get permission from the Hairstons or the Hairstons in order to write your book?
Yes. It was kind of a series of things. I mean, people aren't going to talk to you unless, well, first of all, when I came down to first meet them, I'm making a longer story of this than I have to, but I was just going to write a chapter in a book about them, in an architecture book. And then that chapter got dropped because the photographers had a bad day when they went to Coolamy, so I was sort of free to use the material. Then I got back in touch with Squire Hairston and Judge Peter and said, would you be interested in cooperating with me if I wanted to do a magazine article and then a book? And they both said yes. And then when I went to a subsequent Hairston reunion, Squire took me to the executive committee and asked them if they would formally approve my writing a book, and they said yes. So, I mean, they didn't sign anything. Later, we did sign a document when there was a hope to get a TV miniseries done, but that didn't work out. But there were a couple of interesting things. I could never have written the book except for 2 people. One was Squire, and the other was Peter, because Squire opened doors to me. A number of people said to me as the years went on, I would never have spoken to you, but you came in with Squire. So I knew that you had his approval. And before I went down to Mississippi, Judge Peter made some calls down there to his relatives and said, there's this fellow from New York who's interested in the family, in writing the family history. I think we should cooperate with him because there are certain stories that need to come out. So I got that approval from both sides. Yeah, so.
Great, thank you. And then the next question that I have is, the the white side of the family is Hairston and the black side of the family is Hairston?
Yes.
How did that come to be?
No one really knows, because the name is spelled Hairston.
On both sides?
Yes. Well, and some African Americans who have a very hard R pronunciation pronounce the name Hairston. And so it sometimes is written as Hairston, Harriston. Among the whites, the pronunciation varies. Judge Peter used to say Hoston, and some of them say Hairston. In the southeast, it's called Hairston. So the great writer Zora Neale Hurston is probably part of this family. In Mississippi, it's Hoston, Hosston. But the African Americans usually say it Hairston, as in Jerry Hairston, the baseball player. So.
And the last question that I have is, I know that the research that you've done is very extensive. How do you know when you're done?
When your wife tells you.
Yeah?
No, it's a very interesting question. On any particular area that you're researching, any particular part of the family story, you know you're done when you begin running into the same information in multiple sources, and you say, okay, I've seen that, and you're not finding anything new, and you just have a sense, okay, I've seen everything, and I've got that story as best as I can get it. The other thing, when you're writing a book, you have to put together if you're writing a book that you actually want people to read and you're trying to sell it, it has to have a narrative coherence to it, and it can't be too long, and it has to have an organization, and it can't meander. There were a couple of chapters that got left out. I was going to do, speaking of permission, I was trying to do a long section on the movie star and composer Jester Hairston. But he really didn't want to cooperate with me, except in a minor way, because he said he was working on his own book, but unfortunately he passed away before he finished it. The manuscript does exist, but it's unfinished. But I was thinking of a section on him. I was thinking of a section on the many Hairston athletes. The Hairstons had the first 3 generations of African Americans in Major League Baseball. Sam Hairston, Jerry Hairston, and Jerry Hairston. And they had NBA players. They had a boxer who was deaf named Silent Hairston. Anyway, there were a number of athletes, and I began doing research on that, but I thought, that's too much. The big thing that really hurt me to let it go is I did a lot of research on West Virginia, because a lot of Hairstons walked from this part of North Carolina and the northern and the part of Virginia, all the way into the mountains of West Virginia to get jobs in the mines and on the railroad, on the N&W, and also to establish schools and churches, as they always did. The first thing the Hairstons did was start a church. And I went there, did interviews, did research, but it was just, the envelope would hold only so much. And so I had to put it aside. And that that West Virginia story had one of the greatest disappointments for me, because at a reunion in Columbus, Ohio, I met a woman who lives in West Virginia and said, well, it was my grandparents who were among the people who walked from Stokes County. And I have the cook pot that they carried with them. And I have a couple of other things. And I said, oh, I would love to come to your house and see that and talk to you about that and take pictures. And she said, oh yeah, you could do that. And so we set a date, and I left on a Sunday morning, spent the night in a motel in West Virginia. And when I was just 10 minutes from the house, I pulled off just to call and make sure that they were ready for me. Her husband answered the phone and said, I don't want you to talk to her. And I sat in the parking lot of a Burger King and just wept, because this story was lost. And also it came at a really bad time in the work for me. It was just one of those times, it was just a dead end. It was one too many dead ends coming too fast. And when you're writing a book and your living depends on it, this perseverance takes on a new meaning. So this was just crushing, and it was one of those times when I had to come back home, this time over 64, not 29, and tell my wife, I didn't get anything. So it's like the fisherman who comes back with empty nets,
Thank you.
So, anyone else? Yes, sir. don't you just take that, and then you can hand it back to me. Oh, great.
My name is Ed Hairston, and I came from Cascade, Virginia.
Oh.
You work with my nephew, Dean. So I just wanted to ask you a few questions about Major George.
Okay.
You know, the idea of using similar, like a title for a name, and some of them, I have a brother named Major Lewis, and he got in trouble when he went to the draft board, and they thought he was being smart by naming him, saying Major. He was a major already, but that was his name. And then they have Colonel.
Right.
Do you know, or have you heard why they did that? They named their children with titles such as that? Because I know in the Confederacy there were people that were titled by their rank in service for the Confederacy.
Right.
Is that where it started with that?
I think that's a good question, and I don't entirely know the answer. I think Major George, who was white, he was down in Mississippi, he may have had that rank in a state militia, because the practice was that if you were the leader of the white militia in a given county, generally the highest rank was captain. And then in a region there might be a colonel, but if you were a big shot, you were a captain. And once a captain in the militia, always a captain. So everybody in the region would get in the habit of calling you Captain Henry or Captain Ed. And I also understand, among African Americans, that the name lawyer is often used. There's the great football player, Lawyer Malloy, I think, but I've run across that name in the Hairstons, I think. Yeah, but exactly where Major George's rank came from in his name, I'm not sure. He may have been in the militia.
Okay.
Did you know?
Yeah, I had one other question. In looking at Thomas Hairston down in Vicksburg, now I have a brother named Thomas, and on the book, the Black family, that's my grandfather and his brothers. You got that from Dean. It's in our family, and I have that original painting in my office. So,
that's right.
Yeah, so anyway, his name was Thomas. One of the brothers was named Thomas, and I have a brother named John Thomas. So it's funny how all these things repeat themselves.
Sure.
So it's very interesting. So I admire your work, and thank you a lot for coming.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your time. Dean was crucial in my work, because he comes from Cascade, where Ed is from. And Cascade is right smack in the middle of Oak Hill, Royal Oak, Windsor, and what's the other one down there?
Berry Hill.
Berry Hill, right. There's several of the Hairston plantations there, and it was Dean who took me to the ruins of Oak Hill. And Larry told me today that they have found the Hairston graveyard, the slave graveyard on the grounds of Oak Hill, that Dean didn't know the whereabouts above. I guess it's way, way back down by the railroad line. And there are no markers, but there are just depressions in the ground, which is something that's pretty common.
Where's the original plantation house?
Oak Hill?
Well, what's the original one for the Hairstons here in America? Is it
The
only-
original, well, let's see. Well, they were originally from Scotland, went to Ireland, then went to Philadelphia, then came down the Great Wagon Road, which is Interstate 81, down to Albemarle County. They initially settled in western Albemarle at Rockfish Gap, near a place called Beaver Creek. They weren't there very long, and then they came down to Henry County, and they started a place called Beaver Creek. Offhand, I don't know which is the oldest surviving Hairston house.
What's the one up from toward Eden, up from Berry Hill, the burned out one,
That's Oak Hill.
which has got the big cemetery?
That's Oak Hill. Oh, no, yes, Berry Hill is the one that's on the Berry Hill Road. At least it used to be the Berry Hill Road. That has the big white family cemetery right at the roadside.
That's Berry Hill.
Yes.
Okay, is that the one that was used as the hospital for,
After the Battle of Guilford Courthouse? Possibly. I don't know. I don't know that for sure. Well, yes, they say, the story is that it's spelled Berry Hill, B-E-R-R-Y, but it began as Bury, B-U-R-Y, because British soldiers from Guilford Courthouse battle were buried there. because I guess they had been cared for at the house and then they were buried on the property. White soldiers from the region probably would have been sent home because the militia was from all around Henry County. Their families would have come to get them, I would think. She has a question.
I have a question. I'm mainly interested in Thomas Hairston. That was from Mississippi, Yazoo City.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I have roots in Mississippi. And Ruth Hairston, my family bought property from Ruth Hairston. And Robert Hairston is husband. I'd like to find out how I can find more information about Thomas, Ruth, and Robert Hairston.
Okay. Thomas, you're talking about Thomas Hairston, who fought in the 3rd Colored Cavalry.
Yes.
The last...
Down in Yazoo City, Mississippi.
Right. The last record I could find of him, and this is, I was doing my research back in the 90s, was the record of him being mustered out of the service along with the rest of the 3rd, honorably discharged in Memphis. And then after that, I couldn't find him. I looked through as many census records as I could find. I think I looked through the census indexes of 20 states. And I could not find a Thomas Hairston who fit the age because he had married a woman named Annie. So I was looking for a Thomas who was married to an Annie. And I couldn't find them. Now, with Ancestry.com, you might be able to find that out in a second.
Okay. All right. And then the Robert Hairston. I'm really interested in Robert Hairston.
The one who died in 1852.
His black daughter.
Oh, well, then you got to read the book. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would urge you all to read the book, not because I'm going to make any money out of it, because Amazon sells the used paperbacks for 99 cents. So it's going to cost you more to have it mailed to you than it will to buy the book. But it really is a kind of a primer on how to do this research, because I tell a lot of this in the first person, and I actually tell you in the text where I found stuff. And which library I went to, although I omit I didn't write, okay, now for the next 6 months, I spent in the basement of Alderman Library, UVA, reading microfilms. You don't want to read about, you don't want to know about that, but that's basically what I did. I think maybe I said this before, but I'll say it again. The Freedmen's Bureau records, especially if you're from Virginia, but even in North Carolina, it's a very, very rich record, and it's divided. Many of the records are presented by county, so you can find an awful lot about your family's area, and there are name indexes. The records are very tricky to use. There's no question that they're tricky to use, and some of the Virginia records have been put online, but in a way that's kind of misleading because it makes you think, oh gee, this is everything. Oh no, it's like 2% of everything. And if you're really serious, you're going to need to get some microfilm reels and spend some time with the librarian here and try to figure out which reels to get and how to find your way to the indexes. I wrote a guide to using the Freedmen's Bureau records of Virginia, which I can send to Ina. It's just like a 3 or 4 page guide for how I figured my way through it. I can tell you, not to bore you, but I discovered that in any given region, and I was focusing on the Hairstons, in the tier from Danville to Martinsville, and that whole area had a couple of agents, and they reported to a captain in Lynchburg, Captain Lacey. So after stumbling across a few letters between my guys in Martinsville and Captain Lacey, I realized that if there was some way, if I could get Captain Lacey's full correspondence, then I would get a fuller picture. And so I looked in the indexes that were done in the 1870s, and I found a whole lot of letters to Captain Lacey. So I went looking for those in several different microfilm reels. And lo and behold, a fuller picture of life in that part of Virginia began to emerge. And I was finding out not just about Danville and Martinsville and Lynchburg, but also even about Charlottesville, because Lacey had charge of all the way up to Albemarle County. And you just, it's amazing what you will find in there. I went through everything. And one Hairston woman said to me when she was looking at my footnotes, she said, "Henry, you must have an amazing capacity for tedium." And I said, "Well, that's my business. That's what I have to do." So I went through this subset of Freedmen's Bureau records called requests for travel reimbursements. And because you never know where you're going to find something. And this is more important than it sounds like, because if you were a black woman looking for her lost husband or looking for her lost child, you would have applied to the Freedmen's Bureau for $12 to pay for your train fare to get from Norfolk to Danville. And you would have to explain why you wanted this money. So these, it's like a travel voucher today. I mean, if you go to your boss, you can't just say, "I need $12. You've got to give a detailed thing about what it is. And stories would jump out of this. There was a woman who had been held in slavery at Windsor, one of the Wilson places, by Sam Pannell Wilson. And she wrote a letter to the Freedmen's Bureau office in Richmond saying that she would like to get travel funds to go to Danville and go to the door of Sam Pannell Wilson and demand that he pay child support to her because he had had relations with her and had fathered her child, and she didn't have any money, and she wanted him to pay. So the Freedmen's Bureau officer took this very seriously, but instead of sending her the money, he said, "Well, maybe I'll visit Mr. Wilson first." So he actually rode out to Windsor one day and knocked on the door, and Sam Pannell Wilson comes to the door and he says, "Well, there's this woman whose name is thus and such who says you're the father of her child." Well, darned if Sam didn't give him money. I think it was a substantial amount. I think it was $50 or $100, and said, "Here, give this to the woman." And that was the end of it. And the officer said, "I think this is about the best we're going to do." But that came out of the records of travel reimbursements. Who knew? I mean, so just look everywhere. And maybe you're lucky these days, and that's all on Ancestry.com. Go ahead.
I don't have a very clear question, but a question about reconciliation. In our delving into local history, I guess I would be inclined to keep the notion of reconciliation in mind, or can you say something about reconciliation, about how what we find may or may not lead to reconciliation, may lead to tension as well as reconciliation?
Sure. Yeah, that's a very, very important question. Reconciliation is what's going on right as we speak at Monticello, where the descendants of the Hemmingses are gathering because Monticello has gotten $20 million to refurbish the mountaintop. Most of that is going to a sumptuous renovation of the mansion, and what's going to the African American side is a shanty and a workhouse, which is kind of historically correct. But reconciliation is now very much in the air. I mean, especially at Monticello, and this was one of the things that drew me to the Hairston story. And different people respond in different ways. There is no one correct way to respond to your own family history or to history in general. I have a scene in the book towards the end where there was a big reunion. I mean, in a room this size, with maybe or bigger, at one of the big hotels in Greensboro, and there were several hundred. This is the Hairston reunion. Several hundred black Hairstons there. And they were honoring Judge Peter, actually they were honoring his wife, Lucy. And there were speeches in honor of Peter and his brother Nelson and Lucy. And then one of the leaders of the black family, Everly Hairston, whom I'd gotten rather close to, stood up, said some very nice, because she grew up on their plantation as a sharecropper girl, and did not enjoy the life that was being given to her. And she broke away, much to the dismay of her parents and grandparents, who said, "You can't leave here, you'll never do any better than being a sharecropper." She stood up and she denounced Peter. She said, "You could have done more for us." And I described this in the room. A silence fell across this big auditorium, because no one had ever, especially an African American, no one had ever spoken to Judge Peter that way. And then they applauded. She had said something that had been in the hearts of many of those people, because now, everybody says, well, things are good now. Segregation was the bad days, and it was worse even when you go far back. But change came when it did, and we're okay. But Everly doesn't buy that. She says, looking back into the 1940s and the 50s, you could have done more to push things forward, even in the 60s. And you could have done more for our particular family. You could have paid us, for one thing, instead of making us work in the fields. And then she and Peter had a big argument about it later. She went to the mansion, and they had quite an argument. And the tension, continued to fester. But different people have different responses, and there is no what a number of people said to me is that what bothers the African American side of the family to this day is that the Hairston men had children by the kitchen women and the field women, and they held them in slavery. That they held their own blood kin as slaves. And the African American Hairston says, we cannot get over that. We just can't accept that. It's not we can't accept it, we can't believe it. That you could have a child and send her or send him into slavery. And that's what those people were capable of.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
My family, my mother they're Hairstons as well, and this gentleman here is a Hairston. So is there such thing as different sets of Hairstons?
Oh, she's asking if there's such thing as different sets of Hairston's. Oh, that's a whole other book. Yes. Well, the answer is yes and no, because as far as I know, everybody in this country with the name Hairston or Hairston is descended from one man and his sons who came, white people from Scotland to Ireland to Pennsylvania to Virginia in the 1750s. And the whole Hairston, you're either descended, regardless of your race, because there are a lot of, quote, black Hairstons who are also white Hairstons, as you know. So you're descended from him or from people whom he or his descendants held in slavery. It's all one family. There's no, as far as I know, there was no other Hairston originator who came to this country. That said, in the 1750s, there were three Hairston brothers. There was, I think it was George, I can't think of the others, maybe Sam, George something, and Andrew. Andrew and his wife left Virginia and settled in the Southeast. It was I think it was South Carolina, and brought with them some of the enslaved people they had. And this became known as Andrew's line. They broke off and had no communication. And so that's a separate group. And then among the African American Hairston family, there are kind of sub-clans. I mean, a lot of the Hairstons a lot of white and black Hairstons in Mississippi lost the memory of their Virginia connection. Or they lost any direct connection to it. I mean, I talked to one black woman who said that her mother, it was either her mother or her father, when he was dying, and I mean, he was close to the end of his life and he was suffering from dementia, just kept saying over and over, they came from Virginia, they came from Virginia, they came from Virginia. That's the thing he wanted his children to know, your roots are not here, they're in Virginia. But so there's a cluster in Virginia, and Ed can maybe talk about this. The Cascade Hairstons strike me as being especially clannish and tight. Not many of them go to the National Hairston Clan reunion. And then, to my amazement, about 5 or 6 years ago, I got a letter from the Hairston Gallant family, whose ties are from Beaver Creek in Martinsville. And they were having a reunion in southern Maryland, because they have another outpost there, and they asked if I would come and make a few remarks. And I'd never heard of them. And they're related to lots of Hairstons that I had talked to from Martinsville and Henry County, but they had never surfaced before. And they're their own little tight group. And where else? There are a couple of other little clans of them that, I mean, family groupings that have annual reunions. The Cascade Hairstons still get together 4th of July, right? Or don't they, Ed? Or
Every 2 years we meet in Ohio.
oh, you're going up to Ohio now. Did you always do that?
No, yeah, we started that shortly after we started Ohio, Canada, and Cascade, Virginia.
Okay. You see, because there's another group in Columbus, Ohio area. So, and there's a whole other group in West Virginia.
And we're having our Hairston Clan this year in Danville.
The National Hairston Clan?
Hairston Clan, and then we'd like you to come.
Oh, okay. I'll check I'll be there. I'll be there.
That's an invitation.
Okay.
Okay, we've got time for one more question.
Oh, but Shelley's going to set me straight.
No. Since you mentioned the Freedmen Bureau records, I wanted to share that there is a new website called Mapping the Freedmen's Bureau. A lady named Tony Carrier and Angela Watton-Raji developed this website. You can go to that website, search all the offices, and it tells you where the Freedmen Bureau records are located. And also, June 6th, Family Search, everyone knows what Family Search is kicking, June 19th, will be kicking off a national indexing project, and it's indexing the Freedmen Bureau records. They purchased 1,100 sets of film or records from the National Archives, the Freedmen records. So there will be a national effort to get these records indexed, which would make them available for us to research them. So
Okay.
kicking out.
Great. Thank you for mentioning that. Well, I think that Ina wants us to stop. Have we reached the end? Okay, fine.
One more question.
Okay.
Were there any instances in your research where the oral history or personal memories may have conflicted with any actual research and documents, records that you found? And if yes, how did you reconcile those?
Yes. And there were a couple of instances. One is that Judge Hairston said, well, our family owned slaves, but we never sold slaves. And then I found out that his grandfather had, when Robert died, and they were trying to clear up the estate, his grandfather went down there and auctioned off a lot of slaves, not all of them, but the slaves they had no use for. And he wrote a letter back to Virginia. It was just horrifying. He said he apologized for the low price he got for these people, because he said there were a great many old ones and diseased ones and a great many children. And it was absolutely heartless. I mean, and the brutality of the system comes out right there. And I have a feeling that Thomas Hairston, who ended up in Vicksburg, might have been one of those children who was sold. But, and then I mentioned this to Judge Peter, and he said, well, he had to settle his uncle's estate. And I said, well, that's pretty rough stuff. And then the other thing I found just browsing through, and this is, I want to put in a plug for libraries, the actual physical building of the library, for a number of reasons. One is, it's amazing what librarians know. I mean, you can sit at your computer and you get all this information, but if you go into a library, like you have here, or a library in Danville, you will be dealing with trained professionals who know the sources. And if they don't know, they're trained to be able to guide you to people and places where you can find what you want. So that's the useful thing. And B, you will run into other people who are doing the same things that you're doing. But in terms of just using the physical books in the physical library on a physical shelf, to answer, this goes back to the long-winded answer to your question. On one of those many nights in my research when I was stuck, I was working late every night at Alderman Library, which is open until midnight, and I used to spend a lot of time in the long section of shelves that had Southern history, subject files by Southern history, plantation history, slavery history. And I would just look at the titles and see if there was something interesting. And I tell you how I would read books backwards. I would take books that looked promising, flip them open, and I would look for the counties that I was interested in. I had a list in my head. There would be Henry, Stokes, Pittsylvania, Guilford less so, but Franklin County, Patrick County. I would just quickly look through those. Well, one night the library was about to close, and I was desperately looking through, and I found this little slim volume, and it said Manuscripts in the Collection of Trinity College. And I said, Trinity is the old name for Duke, before the Duke family gave their millions, and they renamed it. So I pulled it open, I opened it up, looked up Pittsylvania County, and it said under Pittsylvania they had a slave trader's account book. And I said, I've never heard of such a thing. So the next day, I called the Duke Library and I said, I found this reference, and the woman looked through it and said, oh yeah, there are a bunch of people in here named Hairston. So I actually drove down the next day to see it, and I made copies of it. But that also contradicted what Peter had said, because the Marshal Hairston of Beaver Creek had turned over a group of his people to this slave trader who marched them in chains in the middle of winter from Virginia down into central Mississippi, and he sold some along the way, but he sold most of them for cash down there. So they did sell slaves. And there may have been one other, there were a couple of things that contradicted the oral history. Oral history is funny because, and you run into this especially with Jefferson, because there's been a lot of, there were not a lot, but there are a certain number of oral histories have come up regarding his plantation, and there are errors in there, and which gives Jefferson's defenders reason to knock down the whole oral history. There was an oral history, was actually written down, but I found there was a letter, I think this came from Dean over in Cascade, that he got from his grandmother, I think, and she described her discussion with her mother, who had been a slave, and said, the reason that we are named Staples is that your great-great-grandmother, Rachel, was raped by the overseer Staples, who was a mean man, and that's how we got the name. And she said that Rachel used to say, and I may be mixing things up, but the exact text is in the book. She mentioned that Sam Hairston, I forget his name, the Hairston who owned Chatmoss was a very mean man. He would lock the colored people into the barn for 3 days without, food or water as punishment, and he had really mean overseers. But he got his punishment because after the Civil War, General Lee was up in the White House fussing with the northern white people for them freeing the slaves when the roof fell and killed a whole bunch of people, north and south. Well, I knew that there had never been a roof collapse at the White House. So I thought, maybe this whole thing is bogus. People make things up, where things get exaggerated as the generations go by. And I mentioned this kind of tentatively to Judge Peter, because Peter, he was not only a lawyer, but he was a judge, and he was very harsh to anybody who was sloppy with his history. And I mentioned this thing about the White House, and he said, that's not true about the White House, but I can tell you all about Sam Hardin. He was in the House of Delegates, and he was one of the people who was killed when the roof of the General Assembly fell. So the oral history was true, except in that detail. So that made me, realize that when you run across an apparent mistake in an oral history or in a document, that doesn't mean you throw the whole thing out. You've got to evaluate the rest of it very carefully. Well, I'm thinking that we should probably end now because we've got a schedule to keep. Is that it? Raffles and stuff?
Yeah, raffles, and we've got DNA kits to give away. But thank you so much, Henry, for coming out and talking with us.
I'm very pleased. Thank you for asking me.